Hello, everyone. This is my reflection on sustainability worldwide and what it is like to live a normal life in 4 different countries and how sustainable aspects of that may or may not be. Because I've lived in these countries and I've got lots of images I can show you, and I'll simply give you a nice little slideshow. But before we launch into that, I need to quickly bring you on the same page here regarding what sustainability is. As you know, we have only the one planet, not two or three, although I suppose we're working on it. And that means the resources that we have available are limited to that one planet. So there are resources that grow back, and they are typically biomatter, trees, animals, even things like that. And then there are those who won't grow back, such as oil, gas, minerals, materials. And then here we have things that we can tap into, resources that could potentially be resources if we harness them, such as currents and the sun and the wind. They're always there, and we are getting pretty good at using them. The challenge that we face as a civilization, as you'll probably know, is that we are not quite as good as nature. A long shot, actually. We're not as good as nature by far in using natural resources and leaving residue behind. So what actually happens is this. Here you have your natural resources, and here in the middle we have our nature, signified by this little dragon. And the little guy is going to use some natural resources and gain energy from them, and then leave some residue behind. And that residue is natural and perfectly fine, even if it's dragon poo. And it actually becomes a natural resource for another being, normally. Maybe ants, maybe flies, who knows. So nature is doing that life cycle thing really well. But we, as a human civilization, have our issues with it. So when we bring the natural resources into our lives, they come in, we consume, and then we create this and that, and actually represent a natural resource, unfortunately. So we try all sorts of things to change that. One of them is upcycling. You might have heard the word upcycling. To upcycle means you use your civilizational trash and you put it back in the pot. Some designer or engineer is performing some magic, and then whatever comes of it can be put back into the circulation. But the thing is, there's an end to that, and you cannot usually upcycle endlessly. We can also do this, the cradle-to-cradle approach, which basically means there is no waste because everything is completely reused. But, endless upcycling would be really, if it were possible. So some object gets born, lives, and dies. When it does so, becomes another new product. And that we would very much like to be able to do that, but with a few exceptions, such as aluminium, we find it very difficult. So cradle to cradle is this. It's basically upcycling, which continues forever. So that's cradle to cradle. And it looks like the life cycles of nature, but it's not. And then we have the carbon balance model, which is a nice thought. So the idea is you put your natural resources in, and whatever you do, it will produce a residue that is equal to what nature would do and equal to what nature will require to replenish what you have consumed. Yeah. So let's look at some statistics, which I always find fascinating. You might have heard of the concept of footprints. I'm using these three countries here, or these three regions of the world, to showcase that. The idea is this. Let's imagine everybody lived like in country or region X. How many planets Earth would we need so that we could do this? Like, let's say everybody on this planet lives like they do in China. Well, you might be surprised to hear that one planet is enough to do that. The way China consumes resources is actually in line with the limits of our planet. But there is a hitch to this, and we'll come to that later. If everybody lived like Europeans on this planet, we would actually need two planet Earths to make this possible for everybody. Two planet Earths with all the resources and the space and what have you. If everybody lived like Americans, we'd need to have four planets. Right, so this China thing, how is it possible that China is doing so well? Well, the thing is, actually, it isn't. It is simply the variety of realities in China that make this possible. In this map here, you can see um, the distribution of energy consumption in China, and the darker it is, the more energy is being consumed. So you can see quite clearly here that there are some parts of China where a lot of energy is used and some parts where it isn't. And there are people in all of these. So some people in China simply don't get a lot of energy to use, and some have everything they need. So the ones that have everything they want and have an abundance of energy are people in places like Beijing or Shanghai and all the big cities. And then there's the countryside and the more the less developed regions where people may not have energy at their disposal as much, and so they're not using as much. But they probably would use it if they could. So when that happens, the whole energy balance of China is also no longer going to look so good. Now, there's this notion of being a little more sustainable. You hear this sometimes from industry. Oh, yeah, we got to do something to be a little more sustainable. Can you be more sustainable? I think you cannot. You're either sustainable or you're not sustainable. It's like I keep saying, you're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. You're not a little pregnant. So sustainable means you can do something forever without harming the planet. And that cannot be a little harm. That must be no harm. Then it's sustainable. And there's more to this. It's not just not harming the planet. It's about these three things here. When you're employing sustainable tactics or approaches, you're doing this in order to benefit people and the planet, and this may surprise you, your profit. Because that is simply how the world ticks. Unless we're making money out of something, we cannot keep doing it. So clearly, sustainability must serve profit. And it can be done. We have interesting examples of countries where this works. I'll show you this. I've just put this together from a few different statistics. So we can basically say that a sustainable country has happy people, an intact nature, and a good economy. Can you have these three at the same time? Yes, you can. Take a look. So here we have the World Happiness Index. This is the list from 2015. And the World Happiness Index shows which countries are happiest. And in it we have Switzerland, Iceland, Denmark, Norway, Canada, Finland, and so on. Is the Yale Environmental Performance Index, also from 2015. And it shows these countries which have the most intact nature, or are at least doing enough or the most to keep that way. And then here we have the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, also from 2015, and it shows which countries perform best economically. So let's take a look. Let's see if we can find one or two that perform well in all three. You've probably already spotted them. So Switzerland is a perfectly sustainable country, at least a fairly sustainable country. They're leading the pack here because they have happy people, intact nature, and good economy. And Sweden is also here in the top 10 in all three. So you can see clearly it is possible to live like this and not badly either. These are nice places to be. Okay. So now I'm going to show you life in 4 different countries using photos that I've taken myself. And the question I'm reflecting on here is simply how sustainable is daily life in these places? First country, China. So how do people live in China? This was taken in Shanghai. It's a fairly nice, average, modern, big high-riser building, a compound as they call them. And this is my apartment in Shanghai. As you can see, they're quite nice and tasteful, even great-looking things. When I first moved into this, I really congratulated myself, thinking, "Whoa, beautiful." And this is normal. This is the kind of place you will rent when you're renting a place. This is not just for expats. This is what everybody has in a big city like Shanghai. So it's perfectly well equipped. You have your shower and heater, everything. In Shanghai, the heat source is that. You see here a corner air conditioning unit, which gets nice and warm, and cats like to sit on them in summer. And it actually caused me incredibly low bills. I got away with a utility bill of, what was it, something like 10, 20 US dollars per month. And energy prices in China are not that low, so it's not that. It's simply a very economical way to heat a place. And now you've seen how huge these buildings are. Clearly, everybody is sharing in the warmth. So if you're putting that many people together in a big building, you will actually heat this quite economically. I think the average person is emitting something like 1200 watts of heat. So if you put a building full of people, it's like a building full of heaters. Here was my kitchen in China, and there you can see the estate agents in the staircase. It's very common to dry your clothes outside the building. It's a funny thing, you're walking through the streets, and up there on the 20th floor there are towels hanging. Funny. You cannot really consume the tap water with a very good conscience in China, because there are various issues with it. So people tend to buy the tap water, and this is a water delivery person. I'm not so sure if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I suppose if you have your drinking water delivered, you may be more cautious in how much of it you consume. You're thinking about whether you're going to have another pot of tea now, or if you put it off till the water boy has come back. Here's the garbage truck. So this is how they're taking the trash out of the apartment compounds. Let's look at the way people get around in China. When you first come to China, you'll be surprised how many big cars there are. And I'm a bit of a petrol head, so I know my cars. And one thing I noticed is that not only do they go for comparatively large vehicles, they also like their engines large. So even if traffic is mostly like this in China, you're doing stop and go traffic in big cities, I'm looking at the Audi A6 there. You could theoretically get this vehicle with a 1.8 liter engine, but hey, They prefer the 2.4 V6 or even 3-liter V6. Who knows why? You don't really need engines that large in the cities, but there you go. The new Chinese lifestyle demands large vehicles with big displacement and high fuel consumption, it seems. This is as of 2015, 2016. They like the comfort, they like the safety, and they like the status. So it's understandable, really. I do too. I like big cars. It's just an issue when a nation of 1.5 billion people begins to love big cars and indulges. So some way out will need to be found so that everybody can keep driving their big cars without eating too much into our resources. There is this though, and these aren't just normal scooters like you would see elsewhere in Asia. These are electric scooters, and it is unbelievable how ubiquitous they are in China. You see these scooters absolutely everywhere. They're wonderful, but they will kill you because they are completely silent. And at night, people will actually often turn off their headlights to save on battery range. So there are some issues with that, and some cities have actually banned them now because of this. There are just too many accidents with them because of that switching off of the light and silence thing. But that is something that can be addressed, and I'm sure they will take care of that eventually. So these are far more common than cars. And I think this is one thing where China is clearly leading worldwide in terms of yeah, zero emission transport. Although, of course, you do need that energy from somewhere, and in China, it's mostly generated by coal power. So, if you're not blowing it directly into the faces of the pedestrians, it's still in the air because you need coal and to burn it at night in the power plants outside the city to recharge this thing. So it's just shifted to a different place. There is a curious perception about modern life in China, which is a little behind what we understand now in the West. China still likes the Le Corbusier style city for the car with wide avenues and big high risers. So nice old historical districts like these in Shanghai are actually considered backwards and not good having because the buildings are low and you cannot bring many cars through there. And they are probably in danger of being taken down, all of them. So this whole concept that you should be able to walk through a city from shop to shop, that's not something you're seeing sustained in China. This is going away, and that is a sad thing. I would love it if more places like these existed still in China. Then there's this. They have amazing fast trains, electric, wonderful, reliable, everything. I've been on them hundreds of times. And when you walk the university campuses, you see this and you're thinking, oh my God, so many people using bicycles. But the thing is, they're not actually using them. These are old bicycles that are parked there, probably by graduates who, might have graduated 5 years ago and they just left their old bicycles behind. Some of these are really rusted and have flat tires. So it seems to me that China has left behind the bicycle and has completely gone motorized and electrified. And I believe that may be a bit of a mistake. They probably shouldn't have dropped the bicycle as readily as they have. So, what counts as durable in China? What is lasting in China? China, to me, has always seemed like a place where change is happening very, very quickly, and everybody seems to think that it's normally for the better. It's usually progress. Everybody loves progress in China, and they think that whenever something's changed, it's better because it's progress. But there are things that stay the same in China. And tradition, for example, tradition and superstition are extremely durable in China. China is a very, very old nation. I often hear the notion that there are 3 to 4 thousand years of culture and tradition, and I believe that. And you see manifestations of that in a lot of places, and it makes life in China very rich and interesting and nice. So you have this is a street in Beijing with all kinds of lanterns. I honestly don't understand all of it, but it's they're definitely there as a durable value. And you don't really see a lot of mending going on in China, simply because it is so easy and so cheap to buy something newer and better. So in that way, it's a bit like America in the 1960s, when suddenly people stopped fixing stuff and just chucked the old thing out and got a newer, better one for less money. So China is at that place at the moment, but you do still see traditional repair people every now and then. And in terms of mentality, I think the Chinese are very much in love with the idea of fixing something. They don't actually like throwing things away. So perhaps this whole mending thing could have a future in China. There's also a definite appreciation for handmade things. So when you go to a tourist spot and the craftsmen are showing you their stuff, everybody goes, "Ooh, handmade." That definitely still means something there. Although most people tend to think that handmade things will be of lesser quality and may have hygiene issues, which, fair enough, may be true too. The actual ideal of Chinese civilization as such is one of tranquility. You see this in a lot of places. You even see this when you read a Chinese menu. Everything seems to glorify serenity and nature and pretty things. And when you go to places where the Chinese are dreaming in their urban planning, you see these manifestations. You see that dream China. And it is very pretty, and it is very cultured, and has a lot of nature in it. So don't you go believing that it's all industrial there. They actually like their nature. Here's a funny example of somebody trying to repair a scooter. The problem with many of these cheap products is that they don't last. So people will try to find all sorts of way to keep their stuff together. You may wonder if anybody is educating people in China for the purposes of sustainability. And actually, yeah, the notion is very strong that something needs to be done, and there are a number of very good thinkers and good programs and initiatives there. I sometimes go to China to hold sustainability workshops like these. So here we are at one of these higher education collaboration things that are done between universities of international standing and industry. And so people will undertake all sorts of upcycling projects. This one here was about using industry waste, virgin industry waste, to create a new line of products. And it gets a lot of press coverage as well. So there is a lot of media coverage, a lot of interest, and the participant numbers are very high, both from China and from abroad. We actually ended up making this thing here, a cat station, or a station for feral cats. And these kinds of products are becoming more and more fashionable in China. You're trying to answer niche problems, something that you would have seen in Japan before. Japan has already for decades been extremely good at creating all these niche products, and this is beginning to pop up now in China. I've previously talked about the understanding of nature in China. Here a bit more on that. civilization and nature belong together in China. When you walk down the streets, when you drive down the streets, you'll be blown away by the extent of very high level um, gardening that must be going on there. There must be armies of professional gardeners who take care of everything. There's a tremendous amount of money and effort spent on making the cities incredibly pretty places using flowers and trees and having lakes and maintaining them and all that. So there is a definite place for nature in civilization in China. And when you leave the cities and try to access nature, that also has a certain element of civilization. This whole thing that you might see in Canada or New Zealand, where people just get on their trekking stuff and then make for the hills and fight their way through the jungle, you don't see that in China. When people access nature in China, they want to do it in a civilized way, wearing city clothes, carrying plastic bags, and stopping for tea every few steps. And there is, of course, nothing wrong with that. It's just that it shows you how the Chinese understanding of nature is. They want nature to be civilized as well, as much as they want civilization to have nature in it. Garden shows like these are extremely popular. They will last for months and attract a lot of people, and they're expensive to access. And people appreciate this. So the Chinese population loves their nature in parks, but it's always cultured nature. They don't go for wilderness as such. It always has to have an element of cultivation. You do see that in the creative solutions you sometimes see on their dogs, and you can also experience cats in cat cafes. Now these cats aren't cats that you can adopt, but they're actually like staff members at the cafe. Every cat is a star here at its respective cafe, and there are professional cat carers who will feed the cats, and the cat feeding is a big event, and everything is cat themed in these cat cafes. It's actually rather cute, and the cats seem to like the company. I mean, they are very sociable animals, but again, here you see how in Chinese culture, nature needs to be cute, and nature needs to be something that fits into civilization. How open is Canada, sorry. How open is China to innovation? Um, this is an interesting one because I think the openness of a civilization is going to determine how successful they're going to be in becoming more sustainable in future. And China, I think, has a few distinct advantages there. I'll show them to you now. One thing is, China has never had the problem that we have in the West, that only certain things are cool. Yeah, here in the West, we have all these macho traditions. If you want to be cool with your set of wheels, it's got to be of a certain kind, and usually it is of a big, loud, heavy, fuel-consuming type. In China, though, you can be cool with something electric. So here's my favorite scooter in China. I still don't know what it's called, but I'd definitely love to have one of these. The police will sometimes have electric cars. There's, nothing wrong with that. And you will see vehicles in traffic that people here in the West would probably have reservations against because they just don't look, macho enough or manly enough or cool enough. Since there is a freedom from stereotype in China, they don't have these inhibitions. So innovative, interesting things that we wouldn't touch for silly conventional reasons, they have no problem with. You do see renewable technology stuff popping up everywhere, and if you're paying attention to what's going on in the wind turbine market or solar panel market, you will know that China leads now as a world user and producer of these technologies. So they have all that. And they are clearly early adopters for a lot of things. This contraption you see used by the man here in the foreground is a solo wheel, and it's simply, yeah, it's like a Segway scooter with one wheel only, and you stand on this thing and balance and you drive along on it electrically. So that was China. Let's look at the next one. Let's see India. I lived in India for a few years, and this was my place. This was a guest house of a university, my kitchen, bedroom, and I mean, clearly you can live more luxuriously in China, in India, but you can also live less luxuriously. So I suppose this here represents a fairly reasonable middle ground of what you can expect in China. In India, sorry, I keep making that mistake. Now here's the bathroom. Two things that I noticed about bathrooms in India that were actually pretty clever are that toilet paper culture that we have elsewhere. They don't have it. You use the toilet, you wash. It's actually not entirely a bad idea. And then um, you see that blue bucket there. I was always wondering what that's for. And I think that is one of the most intelligent things I've ever seen in a bathroom. Everybody has the problem when you're taking a shower, it takes a while for the water to get warm enough so that you dare stand under it and use it. Now in India, they actually catch that cold initial water. They don't just let it go. And then after you shower, you have that large bucket of water, and you can do all sorts of things with it. Like you can use it for cleaning later, or for there'll always be something you can do with water. So this is something from India you can already start doing at home. Have a bucket in your shower and catch the first few liters of cold water that you wouldn't use otherwise. On the right here, you see my living room, uh, right upper corner. And what I found interesting there was you have a lot of apartments in India that don't actually seem to have glass windows because you don't need them. So you have a constant breeze going through, and when you have that plus a ceiling fan, you may not actually even want to have air conditioning. So there's definitely an economical way and probably a healthy way to deal with heat. The reason why I keep coughing here is because I am in an air-conditioned room right now and it's too dry, so I have a dry cough. And well, down here you see my kitchen, which had a gas cylinder. And although clearly the portable gas cylinder is probably not a very convenient feature, it made me think twice about cooking something. Do I really need to cook something? Oh, if I cook now, the gas cylinder will be empty. That's an inconvenience. So having something like that in place actually kept my gas consumption really low. Here you see the thing again. These bars in front of the window, by the way, I was told are not to keep out burglars, at least not human burglars, but monkeys. You do have a bit of a monkey problem in some parts of India, and they will come in and do things you wish they didn't. Now here's an apartment of a colleague, and we're having a nice Indian dinner here. So you can see here life in India is actually also quite comfortable for some, and for some it's not. But I think it is interesting to bring up this image because it shows a lifestyle that some of the more hardcore environmentalists who are romanticizing simplicity are perhaps implying everybody should be living. In India, a lot of people have to, and it's a sad thing to see. This was just the view from my balcony, really. How do people get around in India? What has really struck me as amazing is how efficiently they transport things and people. They really manage often to carry things that we in the West would need a lot more energy inefficient vehicles for. I mean, look at this street vendor. He's using a moped, and he's probably transporting what we would transport in a Ford F-150 pickup truck. Scooters, as in a lot of places in the world, are very popular in India, and they are very energy efficient and, makes sense. People use buses. And then there are these very famous motor rickshaws, which are used both as trucks and taxis, sometimes also as private vehicles. And they're extremely fuel efficient. And the new ones, I believe, actually have four-stroke engines now rather than the smelly two strokes. They're clearly not safe. I'm sure terrible accidents happen with these. But they do consume very little fuel, and they're good enough to get around the big cities. People are walking a lot in India, often for financial reasons. And I suppose that is one way in which a culture can be more sustainable. If you're prepared to walk long stretches of road, it will make a difference, especially when you have a lot of population. What lasts in India, and how is durability seen in India? I find that one of the most durable things in India seems to be its spirituality. It's a very complex um set of religions, I find, and cultures, and they simply prevail. And nature in itself is seen as eternal in India, I think. It's like the fountain of life that everything comes from and goes back to. So India has, I think, a very intact sense of belonging to nature. And natural rhythms and natural durability cycles are expected in India, which means people expect less durability of their objects, I think. Here in the upper right hand corner, you see the heel of my shoe, which had broken. And the gent here on the left, shoemaker, fixed it for me with sutures, like you can see here. I was very surprised at first. As I told him, but sir, this is probably going to be broken again next week. To which he said, then you come back next week and we will fix it again. And actually, it made sense. Why would we put glue in there and make it last 3 weeks when sutures can do the same job and you just need to fix it a bit more frequently? So there's an acceptance that things will break soon and often, as nature does. The home, I think, in India has a status as an eternal something. My impression was that all my Indian friends, when they had something important to do, they had to go back to their hometowns because that is, as I understand, where all the registers are kept, where all their documents come from. So no matter where they have relocated to, it all comes back to their initial homes. And another thing, I may get this wrong, but apparently, if you're rich, you eat from steel stuff in India. And that is very durable. And perhaps that is why they're using it. It doesn't break as easily as ceramics or crockery. Sustainability education In India, well, this is an interesting one because I lived in India as dean of a French design school, and we had all these projects where we were interfacing with agents from traditional manufacturing industry. And we visited these places where people were making things in traditional ways. So my Western students learned how they were doing things. And I'm beginning to think now that this is really what this was truly about. We initially set up shop in India thinking that we would bring something new and useful to to India. When actually, I think what we were doing is we were learning Indian things that were superior to what we had to offer. So I find it hypocritical of us Westerners to go into India and try to talk to people about sustainability when clearly they have actually beaten us to the game probably thousands of years ago. Some examples of student projects that we try to do, you can see they have a very Western touch, and it's just not appropriate, I think, for an Indian context. So the suitability of our Western values in India were something I began to question very much. And India is a place where they have their own universe of spirituality, nature, and commerce all interwoven. And I just don't think that our Western approaches um, can and should be in there. So here we have an example of a person consuming coconuts and drinking coconut milk. And you will find that as you're walking through the cities, there will be a tolerance of nature everywhere. You have donkeys, you have cows, and they just live there like people, which may again be a spiritual thing. Um, Nature has a sort of equality or a higher sense of equality in civilization in India than it does elsewhere. Because due to religious views, animals are viewed as pretty much equals to us humans, aren't they? So this creates a peculiar atmosphere. And there's also a sense of spiritual places that people go to that are in nature normally. And overall, you just feel like India is at ease with nature and accepts nature as equal. How open is India to innovation is a question that I found difficult to answer because much of the new stuff that India has seen has been brought in from the outside, such as colonial things, and it wasn't always welcome, as we know. There are some things that clearly have found their place, such as aluminium foil has a very practical application, so people will actually adopt things like these, of course, or other commodities like yeah, car deodorizers. But you always get the feeling in India that they only get comfortable with all this industry stuff once it has been personalized and once some personal artwork has been applied. So there's a real sense of making it yours, making it special, making it personal, making it individual and unique every time. I really get the feeling that India is not at ease with a society that creates mass produced, serial produced, uniform things. Here we have an electric Indian car, the Reva, And when I saw this, I thought there's something very strange about this, because on the one hand, you think, yeah, it's good to see that they have electric cars. But I was also thinking, would they even need this to solve a problem, um, if they hadn't started taking in Western ways? They might not have needed this. So much for India. Another place I lived in is New Zealand, and I found New Zealand an interesting place because it's clearly isolated from the rest of the world, and it sits in a location where you wouldn't expect a modern Western country that, by all means and purposes, compares to places like Britain or Canada. So, what does it look like to live in a house in New Zealand? Um, you may find this scene quite familiar looking if you're not from New Zealand or Australia. So there's a certain American, almost Californian touch to the cities. The lifestyles are often suburban, so you have a business center in your cities and then sprawling suburbs. And you drive out there, and people often have SUVs, as we do in the West. Now here's an indoors area. This is my house. Um, so it is completely Western, and that sometimes feels a bit funny because you know where you are on the planet. And that this was completely imported, really. But that is, of course, another thing that gives New Zealand its character. It has a very strong British touch. Living outdoors is a bit of an expectation, and heating is often revolving very much around wood. So here's my neighbor with his Toyota 4x4 full of firewood. Happy to have it because this is how you heat often. How do people get around in New Zealand? It's a car country, clearly, because there isn't that much public transport, and you have a lot of empty landscape with a little bit of housing in it. So you need individual transport to get around. And even though the roads are good, you will never average a very high travel average during the day because you do have to go slow. There are mountains, there are villages to be crossed. And most of the vehicles that are sold in New Zealand seem to be used cars from Japan, which are brought in with low mileage and in excellent shape. And they seem actually quite old by Western standards. So you have a lot of vehicles driving around that are a good 20 years old, not very fuel efficient, and also not very safe because when you have a car that old, it simply isn't as far advanced in active and passive safety as a more modern car would be. So you do get um, quite a few more traffic fatalities than you would in some other Western countries. There's a lot of shipping going on, obviously. Lamb and deer and natural products like that come from New Zealand and are very highly prized commodities in other places. New Zealand lamb is, as you know, a delicacy. And it leaves in these big ships, which are sometimes criticized for being wasteful, but I don't think they are actually. I think some studies show clearly that this can be more sustainable way of shipping stuff out than doing stuff locally with trucks. That's what I heard, at least on the example of Austrian versus Argentinian apples. City transport exists, looks like this. This could be anywhere. This could be a city in Germany or wherever. And then there's the car thing. In New Zealand, you have a bit of the old Australian Holden versus Ford thing. So you have Holden people and you have Ford people, and they, of course, like their cars big. This used to be my old car. So what is durable in New Zealand? Um, New Zealand is a young country, So they treasure their history very much, and it isn't very old history by European or Asian standards, maybe about 150 to 200 years maximum. So you see a lot of Victorian era things like steamship in Queenstown, or you have all these events where again Victorian British things are being celebrated. And this seems to be sticking around. This is the founding culture of New Zealand, and this will always have a place there, I believe. And I mean, you look at a place like this, I think this is Oamaru in the South Island. This looks so much like a British city. There is another kind of durability in New Zealand, and that is anything to do with Maori heritage. The Maori are, yeah, the natives of New Zealand, and there are a lot of protected areas that they're protecting fiercely, and so that makes these places, yeah, durable. What is not durable is the private homes and generally the cities and architecture because of the tectonics of New Zealand. So when you have a house in New Zealand, it is very often not built on a concrete foundation or a basement like you would have it elsewhere, but they build their houses on little piles, as they call them, for many different reasons. So they are basically like furniture that is standing in the landscape. And as the land shifts and as these houses age, you will constantly need to make adjustments. And it's normal in New Zealand in your house for a wall not to be entirely straight, for the house to basically shift shape over the years. In terms of education, New Zealand is a modern country like any other Western country, Britain, Canada. So institutions, tertiary institutions and schools will be ambitious about becoming sustainable themselves. And it is easy for New Zealanders to connect with the outdoors, so they like to be outside and go camping and stuff. You have this in New Zealand. This is a possum, and it's actually not from New Zealand. These animals were brought in from Australia originally for fur breeding, and they got out and started procreating. And now New Zealand is overrun by these animals, which on the one hand are incredibly cute, but on the other have really destroyed the majority of the bird population there. So it's a sad situation. On the one hand, you have these cutesy things, and on the other hand, you wish them dead. The ocean is another great area of experiences of nature in New Zealand, and people have a very alive surf culture. And you take it for granted that you can go and collect food out there. It's a very clean country, you don't have industry, and it is often perfectly safe to just go out there and get yourself some cockles and mussels and things. Here's a colleague of mine uh, just collecting some dinner, really, which we then cooked up at home. So, how do the New Zealanders see nature? My impression is that it is still very much a country with agricultural values. So, even though, of course, they enjoy and romanticize nature in a Western way, they will also take fairly sober agricultural views, which makes sense, you know, if you're running an agricultural economy. And this also pervades life in New Zealand. You will have farmers markets. There's a general feeling of ease with, yeah, growing stuff at home, digging through your garden. It is a country that is feeling at home with its agricultural side. It's also a country that is proud of its interesting species and is doing a lot to educate everybody about them and their needs. So wherever you go in New Zealand, you find areas that are special and where you will be told what's going on there so that you're not interfering with it. But you still get this, you have, yeah, there are cute animals, but actually none of these three here come from New Zealand. I wouldn't actually know if there are any cutesy New Zealand animals. Here we have a goat. They didn't exist in New Zealand before Europeans arrived. In the lower left-hand corner, I'm cuddling a possum, and in the right-hand image here, I'm feeding a wallaby, which is from Australia. So um, some of the natural things in New Zealand aren't actually from New Zealand. It has to be said, though, that neither possums nor wallabies are considered so welcome in New Zealand because they don't come from there and they are upsetting the natural balance. So what you can do is sit back and appreciate it all with a cup of coffee. And I think if all the serious environmentalists had their way, and I wish they did, uh, we would be able to do that and see all the different bird species coming back. How open is New Zealand to innovation is a question that I find interesting. New Zealanders will normally be quick to tell you about the number 8 wire mentality and the Kiwi way and how they're pretty good at improvising. And I would say there is a bit of truth in that. They clearly have a pioneer attitude like you would see in parts of the United States, Canada, and places like Argentina and Chile. Um, there are people interested in technology. They will try to solve problems around that. Here's us building an electric prototype. And that number 8 wire mentality is all about, yeah, how can I say, living a good life without requiring overly complicated implements for it. So finding a way to keep warm, keep fed, uh, within the means that you can realistically be expected to have, something that endears New Zealanders, I think. You will often find attitudes of self-sufficiency glorified in people. People love to grow their own stuff and be able to cultivate what they need themselves. And you have obviously interesting things going on that add richness to this, such as all the different kinds of cockles you have there, um, or what you can see along the way. Here I am hiding in one of the more rocky boulders. So that was New Zealand. And now let's look at the final one, Sweden. What does it look like to live in Sweden? Here's an image from my village. When you come to Sweden, you get the impression that a lot of people live in fairly small houses, and they are actually called småhus. And that was a house concept that popped up in the 20th century, with the idea that really, if you have a normal 20th century sized family, you don't need a huge house. Houses in Sweden used to be very large in its agricultural past because you had the farmer's family with his hundreds of children and all the servants and their children living there. And that's no longer the 20th century style. So Swedish family homes often actually seem quite cute and small by comparison to the homes you might see in places like Canada or Germany. And now here's my bedroom, for example, and you'll find that it makes a lot of sense. This is the inside of one of these småhus from the 1950s. So you have little space to heat, and it is actually perfectly enough. There's also the sense that it would be nice if cities were walkable. Swedes like to walk if it's not too far. So the trick might be to keep your settlements small and walkable. Now, here's an extreme example, obviously, from the west coast, Bohuslän. And then there's a sense of premium insulation in these homes. This is a triple glazed window in my dining room, and they block out noise perfectly, and obviously they keep you comfortable at minus 30 degrees Celsius as well. A large part of the year, though, life happens outside. This might surprise you, but the thing is, if you're living that far north, the sun may barely set some days, so you will have extremely long days. And since the climate tends to be quite sunny, it means things heat up. So you do get over 30 degrees, and it's wonderful to be out in the garden. I think I might have taken this picture around 11 at night, one July evening. What's it like to get around in Sweden? Distances tend to be pretty long. It's a comparably large country with pretty few people in it. So that means you only have few cities and a lot of nothing in between them. So distance is a factor whenever you go places in Sweden. You have a modern train system with electric trains that travel fast. And then you have very good roads where you can travel at fairly constant low speeds. The speed limits in Sweden will seem incredibly low to some, actually almost North American. And it has many reasons. One is that there is really no benefit in driving fast. There's a lot of risk in driving fast, and you are much more likely to have a collision with an elk if you go fast, because elks can apparently process speeds up to 70 kilometers per hour mentally perfectly fine. But if something moves quicker than that, they cannot get out of the way anymore in time. So their brains just haven't got the reflexes. So one effect of going slow in Sweden is that yeah, you're going slow in high gear most of the time, so you have crazy low fuel consumption. This is the vehicle computer of my father's BMW 528, and it's actually showing a fuel consumption of well, what would this be in British miles per gallon? Something like 45 mpg on a big petrol engine. Sensational. So you consume very little in Sweden by comparison with other countries, which makes it acceptable to drive big cars, and you'll want that on ice and snow. So you do need to get around somehow by car. Um, this is a taxi booth where you can order taxis in the city of Åre. And now, as pretty as this is, imagine you're living in a place like this, and often old people, for example, do. They will retire to a little cottage like this. Imagine it's winter and you need to go see the doctor. What do? You need a car or a friend with a car. There isn't going to be a bus that stops in front of one of these. So there will always be a need for personal transport solutions. And what lasts in Sweden? There is a historical expectation that cities will always have age and will be venerable old things. And you come to the Swedish cities, and they are glorious big old cities with wonderful old buildings in them. That is a key expectation, that that is how a city is, full of big old stately buildings. And people also like big old stately cars. It's a very Swedish thing for a guy to have an old American car 5. I surely do. And you just expect to always have this. So you don't think that you're going to consume your car and then it'll be on the scrap heap. But Once you have an American car or a vintage car, you will always have it. And that may extend to vintage boats and to certain traditions. Uh, these kinds of waffles you can probably find in old paintings by Anders Zorn already from the 19th century. This is just a staple Swedish thing that will always have to be served exactly like this. And there is a certain amount of romanticism about doing things the old-fashioned way. This is a Sunday cafe where people are getting together just for the sake of making pancakes and boiling coffee uh, the old way, as you would have done it 200 years ago, just because it's nice. So again, tradition is a lasting thing in Sweden. With a country where you often live in isolated settings, uh, you appreciate resources. So, when you see an old Volvo standing around, I would think in America that would probably just be some old beater. In Sweden, you might go, oh, there might be maybe 40 left in the country, and this is one of them. I might take an interest and keep this, perhaps secure it for myself. And like I said, you see a lot of people hanging on to old cars in Sweden. Sometimes they will just get together for what they call a cruising. So you have all the old car enthusiasts swarming out all over the city, driving around, meeting, chatting. And I would imagine people are looking out for tomorrow's classics today. You just know what is cool and what will stay cool, and you get that and you keep that. There's also a sense in Sweden that there will always be wood because the forest is eternal and it's always there and it covers most of the country. So it gives you a sense of reassurance that there will always be wood as a resource. And wood can also last. Here on the right, we see a very old building that was built from wood. And the older, more experienced woodworkers will tell you that there's really no reason why wood shouldn't last almost as long as stone. And this durability glorification has permeated a lot of Swedish things, also the cars. Now let's look at how people get educated for sustainability in Sweden. I think the one thing in Sweden is that you don't need to it is not hard to make a case for sustainability in Sweden because everybody is quite aware of what happens if you run out of resources and that they are, of course, limited because they don't come from Sweden unless it's wood, But this whole thing about oil or something like that, people are quite cognizant of the fact that they're very vulnerable without it and that it doesn't come from Sweden. So there's always been an unease about using this stuff. And there's also a sense that nature is actually a living space. So, of course, you don't want to dirty it. It's not like you're throwing your trash into your living room, right? So you live in nature in Sweden, and of course you keep it clean because of that for yourself. A lot of people in Sweden grow up with a farm in the family. So it's quite common for people in Sweden to have experience with animals and to know what it's like to be in the countryside. A lot of people know how to operate agricultural machinery, probably more than a lot of other Western countries. And even when you're looking at the food, this is all, down to earth, agricultural, farmy type food that you could see being made with the means of a 19th century farm. So the food culture very much takes its ideals also from the world of agriculture. Pretty much preempted the bit on understanding nature. I think a lot of the things in Sweden are as high quality as they are because of the sense of limitation. You know, for example, that the seasons are really very strong seasons. You will never mistake spring for autumn or winter for summer, as you might in other places, like in Britain or in New Zealand. So you act within a window of opportunity to enjoy each season as much as you can, and you do typical seasonal things, and that means nature is a very strong reminder of its own presence and a facilitator of what you can do and how you can live. So this restaurant here is clearly going to look very different in winter. Right now in summer we've got everybody lounging outside. In winter all this furniture will be cleared away, the windows will be closed, and everybody will be inside with candles and fires. Despite its northern location, nature is full of edible things in nature, and people expect to do that. People expect to eat what grows in their garden, go into the forests and pick mushrooms, maybe go to the ocean and get some mussels. And there is a very strong composting culture as well. This is me after breakfast getting rid of the tea and going down to my compost heap in the garden. That's just what you do. So nature is also a bit of a communal living space. Like I said before, we tend to consider nature as our extended living room. And here's that little Sunday cafe again, where people get together to drink coffee outside. I mean, why would you go someplace to drink coffee outside? Well, clearly because you want to enjoy the place and the experience of being in nature. How open is Sweden to innovation? You may have heard about Geert Hofstede, the Dutch scientist, who has created what is called the masculinity index. And the masculinity index is a very amazing thing. It basically states how masculine the values of various societies are. I think he has so far, this is as of 2017, examined 60 different countries, and Sweden came out bottom, which means it is the least masculine country in the world. And that means Swedes will do stuff that may look ridiculous and that other people wouldn't be seen dead with. So that helps innovation. If you're not worried about looking silly, you will try stuff. And the Swedes do that. So there is a very easy relationship with overcoming convention. Here, for example, you see a breakfast, train breakfast, served on the train to Stockholm. And the cutlery is made from wood, and it's all served in a cardboard box. Clearly, there's still room for improvement here. You know, we still have plastic. We want to get rid of that eventually. But you can see how these kinds of things are happening there, and they're just part of life. This is another Swedish thing. This is a recycling facility, and pretty much every village and every city has one or more of these. And when you're done with your trash, you have neatly sorted it into different types, and you will then take it to the respectable and respective containers. So there will be one for aluminium, one for cardboard, one for newspapers, one for plastic, and so on. And everybody is very much adhering to these and trying their best to make the garbage sorting a reality. I would say Sweden is lucky because the ideals of society in Sweden suit sustainability ideals quite easily. That's a mentality thing. Um, Swedes like to use wood, which is of course carbon neutral if you do it right. There is a natural sense of not overindulging, lagom, which is another natural thing to them. And so, in that way, I would think Sweden is probably a bit privileged culturally in terms of sustainability. I think it's one of the easier places in the Western world to integrate sustainable living into a comfortable lifestyle. I really like this image here because it shows what Sweden hinges on. You have industry, you have people inventing stuff. It's probably just a funny coincidence that the truck here on the right is owned by a company called Invent AB, and then you have this abundant resource, wood, at all times. So wood, inventing stuff, and industry. I think that really is what Sweden is and what is enabling it to be what it is in terms of sustainability. So this is the place where I normally ask people if they have any questions. Um, we don't really have a way for you to talk back to me here, but if you'd like to leave comments, please do. And yeah, I hope you found this a little interesting. I know it's just a little reflection, not much of a doctrine or anything like that, just my observations of what it was like to live in all these different places. So, wishing you all the best and see you around. Bye bye.